Just as a review, a little practice here, some practice intervening with our middle schoolers. So if you remember from last week, this was the kiddo, the middle school anti-screen time conspiracy. This was the kid who met Dad at the car door with tears in her eyes, saying it's not fair. All of my friends get as much screen time as they want, and I get stuck with these lousy 2 hours a day. Right? Our typical response to that is what? Good luck. Yeah, you should be thankful you have 2 hours. Some logic might even be, okay, you're saying all of your friends get as much screen time as they want. That can't possibly be true. I'm going to email all of your friends. I'm going to email all of their parents, and we're going to set up this really logical list here and see how many of them really get 2 hours or get as much screen time as they want, right? What's that?
That would cause some serious upset saying I'm going to email.
Sure. And where is our teenagers, our teen or tween, our middle schoolers' brain at this point? We got a flipped lid, don't we? And when we have a flipped lid, if we're coming at her with a lot of words and a lot of logic, you're absolutely right. That is just it's like pouring gasoline on the fire. It's going to flip her lid. She's probably even stuck like over in that right brain, that feeling, like it just feels unfair. Anytime you hear, that's not fair. Has anyone heard that? Hey, raise your hand if you've not ever heard that. That is a really good indicator that a kiddo is in their right brain, because that's where a lot of that social justice lives, is in our right brain, our passions, and what fuels us and what kind of builds that fire within us is over in that right brain. So she's saying, this is not fair. Everyone else gets something that I don't get. They're all getting as much screen time as they want. I only get these lousy 2 hours. So what could we do instead of coming at her with logic? We've got a few options up here. We've got engage, don't enrage, name it to tame it, connect to redirect, or give her more sleep. Which one of these is a good go-to? What do you think? We've got a kid with engage, don't enrage. Perfect. What might that look like? She's sobbing. She's right at your car door. What's that? Ooh, a hug might be nice, huh? A hug might communicate, I hear ya. Ooh, this is hard. This doesn't feel so good, does it? How about a name it to tame it? What might that look like? So we could engage, don't enrage. We could get soft. We could get in her space. We could communicate that we're not a threat. And then we maybe do some name it to tame it. What could we say to this? Yes?
Possibly, I guess, maybe you can probably get them to, realize what they're feeling.
Yeah.
Assess it a lot better and maybe get their pumps off a lot better.
Perfect. Absolutely. Fantastic. Get her to understand what it is she's feeling. Her brain's just exploding with emotion right now. Name it to tame it. That's the name of the game here. We can put some words on it. So we might say something like, wow, that feels really unfair. You feel like all of your friends are getting something that you don't get, and that feels unfair. See, we're not saying it's accurate. We're not saying it's true. We're not saying it's false. We're just bringing to light what it is that she's feeling. You feel left out. You feel really like this is just really, really unfair right now. And the end of the story is that's how the parent responded. Looked at the kiddo, got on eye level, so did some engage, don't enrage. I am not a threat here. And just did a quick name it to tame it, right? Hey, this feels really unfair to you. You feel like you're getting left out. All your friends get something great, and you feel like you're not getting that. The kid's eyes dried up and felt this really amazing connection to the parent and said, yes, you get it. You understand what's going on with me, don't you? And then the parent said, yeah, and we can talk about this later. I bet you there's a solution we can come up with. But for right now, I'm going to need to go on back to work. So they got through that moment and were able to reassess the situation a little bit later. That's the way it could look. So how about our high schooler who has broken curfew? Remember, this is the kid who's branching out, making new friends, biking to friends' houses, and he showed up 45 minutes late, 11:45 on a weekend. You're worried sick. He burst through the door, eyes puffy like he's been crying, and he just darts to his room, slams the door, and there he is. What might we try with this kiddo? What's going on? What's happened? So we might communicate some concern. Yeah, we want to hear your side of the story here, right? Let's talk? Sure. So what if it's hey, let's talk? How's that going to go? Right.
Let's come in and sit down and let's talk about this.
There you go. Did you hear how nice that was when she said that? That's engage, don't enrage, right? I'm not going to throw gasoline on your fire. I'm going to communicate, hey, looks like something happened here. I want to hear your side of the story. I want to hear what's going on for you. Let's talk. Let's talk. Let's see what's going on. At this point, it's going to be anything and everything that's going to get this kid's lid back down. We have got a crisis situation with our kiddo right here. He's obviously very upset. Is our logic about him breaking curfew going to help at this exact moment? Probably not, right? Is that something we're going to need to talk about? Oh, of course, eventually, right? But if we come at him with our logic first, if we come at him with the heavy-handed, upstairs brain, parent got it all under control, it's probably going to drive him deeper and deeper into that downstairs brain. And it's going to say, you see, I shouldn't have trusted after all. I was right not to trust because here comes the lecture. If we can engage first, engage, don't enrage, that communicates safety. At this point, he is in his fight or flight brain. He needs some safety. He needs anything that feels safe in his life right now. Because once he finally got calmed down and the parent came to him with that engage, don't enrage, what they found out was that he just got broken up with by his very first girlfriend ever. And remember what we talked about teen brain last year. How big of a deal is this to a teenager? The biggest deal ever in history, because this is the first time they're feeling some of these emotions for the first time. The reward centers are huge. And remember when we talked about social rejection registers like a physical assault. So his brain is feeling like he's been assaulted at this point. So if we come at him with a lot of words and a lot of logic, it's not gonna go so well. So once the parent heard, came to him with a calm, heard he was broken up with by his first girlfriend, he was being consoled by his peers, which is also super important, telling him it was going to be okay, and he was trying to get himself together so he didn't come home in tears. He was doing a lot of hard work as a teenager, wasn't he? So it's all about how you come at it. So we agree that some of these rules are super important. Our expectations are super important. How we get those met is really the name of the game here. It's can we get our expectations met, have our children become the people we want them to become, the smart, bright, respectful, courteous citizens, and still have good relationship with our kids. We want both of those things. Fantastic. All right, so we're going to finish up with getting to know your child. We looked at the brain, we looked at the nervous system, we looked at their attachment, we looked at development, getting curious about what's going on for kids. Tonight is the night where we are going to look at trauma. We're going to look at when things have not gone well for our kids. And you might be asking, why would we do this in a parenting group? We're talking about parenting. We're talking about how to connect with our kids. By the end of the night tonight, you'll have kind of some numbers in your head around just how many kids have experienced trauma. And if it's not your kid, more than likely, one or two of their friends has experienced trauma, or maybe experiencing trauma right now. And more than likely, if you're sitting at a table of three, two of you have experienced trauma, as we'll look at the numbers tonight. So some of this is getting to know our community well and understanding our own children, but understanding our children's friends, our neighbors, and even getting to know ourselves as parents a little more through this too. Because the numbers around trauma are actually pretty staggering. So that's what we're going to cover tonight is what it is, what it looks like, how it happens, and something, what can you do about it? When it happens, what can you do about it? All right. Oh, but before we get there, little tidbits of truth from Dan Siegel, his Yes Brain book. So he's doing some tours and some lectures around this, and I just wanted to share these with you because I think they're super helpful here. So these are Dan Siegel's 3 truths around parenting. The first thing is, there's no such thing as a perfect parent. How's that sound for you? You want to feel a little sigh of relief there? That's good. It's just kind of a myth. Perfect parenting doesn't exist. Good enough parenting is great. His second truth is repairs can be more important than mistakes. If we've made mistakes with our kids, if we are in the process, if we're currently making mistakes with our kids, those repairs that we make with our kids can be possibly more important than the mistakes that we made in the first place, which is really going to fit well with the trauma part here. And the third thing is that parenting is actually a journey. It's not a destination that at some point you're going to get to and, oh, now I'm a great parent. It's the whole thing is a journey. The whole thing is about learning and growing with your child along the way. They will make mistakes. You're there with them. You will make mistakes. They are there with you. You're going to grow together through a lot of this. And boy, it's nothing quite as powerful as when you've had one of those bad parent moments. Boy, I've had them. Had a pretty good one this past week. And being able to look at my daughter and say, hey, sometimes I don't do the things that I wish that I did. I sometimes my emotions get the better of me. Sometimes I get a little flipped lid myself sometimes. And sometimes I end up doing things that I wish that I hadn't done. And you know what? It was not okay. Not okay for me to raise my voice like that. Not okay for me to have these kinds of expectations on you sometimes. Not okay. And in that process of acknowledging my faults to my kid, this beautiful thing happens. All of a sudden now I've set the standard that guess what? Nobody has to be perfect in this household. And when mistakes happen, we don't have to hide them. We can take them right out in the open and take a look at them. We don't have to be ashamed of those things. We can learn and we can grow from our mistakes together and possibly become even better than we were in the first place. So it's really a pretty awesome thing. That's that idea of humility. Parenting with humility creates children who can be lifelong learners as well as parents. So we're going to look at impacts of trauma on the developing child. Everyone remembers this. We've talked about this several times now. Our model of the brain, our upstairs, our downstairs, our left and our right hemispheres. Our upstairs is for what? Was that?
Our higher reason.
Yes, higher reasoning. Upstairs, thinking, reasoning, logic. Downstairs is what? Emotions, feeling, fight, flight, freeze. And our lower level, our heart rate and our breathing, sleep, wake, those sorts of things are down in the basement in the brainstem. What we're going to look at tonight is a particular type of disintegration. Remember, integration is when the whole brain's working together. Upstairs, downstairs, talking to each other. Hey, here's a feeling. Upstairs, hey, this is what that feeling means. This is a word for it. This is why you're probably feeling this way. And you're able to cope with the feeling, communicate the feeling, go on with life. However, when trauma hits, this is an immediate flipped lid. This is a survival mechanism within our brain. When life is good and life is predictable and life is throwing at us the things that we can expect, then we have an integrated brain. We've got all those parts working well together. When any kind of traumatic event happens, our frontal lobe goes offline. Our upstairs becomes overwhelmed. And if that's the case, what are we left with? We're downstairs. We've got our emotion, our fight or flight. We've got our sensory. We've got our heart rate, our breathing, our sleep, wake. But we've got, basically, we're kept alive, and we go into this highly emotional, highly reactive, sensory, experiential type of existence. We don't make memories well when this happens, and sometimes we make memories too well. Some of those experiences that happen in the midst of trauma are burned into our brain in the sense, which is, again, a survival mechanism. Our brain is getting flooded with sensory information that we can't quite process rationally. But we see something, and this is why sights, sounds, smells, taste, touch, all of those sensory things that happen at the point of trauma become highly embedded in our brains. And this is why when sometimes we might smell, see, taste, touch, hear something similar to something that happened at that traumatic event, it might trigger our brain right back to that point of trauma. It's trying to protect. It's trying to say, hey, last time you heard that, saw that, smelled that, tasted that, touched that, really, really bad things happened. So it puts your body in this heightened state of alert and arousal to protect you from what may be coming next. So that's kind of what it looks like in the brain. This is how trauma kind of, we get an immediate flipped lid, but it also, over time, has some impacts just kind of on our existence overall. And Kaiser Permanente, the insurance company, did this really amazing study. It's known now as the ACE study. But this was between 1995 and 1997. There were over 17,000 participants. Those were people who had Kaiser Permanente insurance. They had a huge number to pull from. And if you know anything about research, 17,000 is a really high number for a sample group. Really high number, 17,000. So they surveyed 17,000 people who had their insurance with this purpose. What they wanted to know, which is something that insurance companies want to know, is what is expensive around healthcare. What are some costs associated with healthcare? And the way they started looking at this was, hey, people who have difficult things happen early in life, adverse childhood experiences, people who have difficult things happen, does that matter? Does that really follow someone for their life or not? Is it something that people just kind of get over? Or are there any connections that we can find that might impact a person's health all throughout the lifespan? So what they did was they broke it down into 10 categories. Well, 3 categories and 10 different things you could score on. And so the ACE score is a 1 out of 10 score, based on all of these criteria. So within abuse, what they would ask was, is there physical, emotional, or sexual abuse that you experienced as a young person? For neglect, they would ask, was there physical or emotional neglect? Did you have enough food? Did you have shelter? Did you have housing? That's physical neglect. Were you someone's darling? Were you cared for? Were you told that you were precious to someone? That's that idea of emotional neglect when that's missing. Then they looked at 5 different areas of household dysfunction. They said when you were growing up, was there someone in your household with mental illness? Was there someone who went to jail, an incarcerated relative in your household? Was mother treated violently? So was there domestic violence towards mother? Was there substance abuse? And was there divorce in your household? So they roll this out, right? And they start asking physicians, primary care physicians to start doing this screening with all of their patients. Physicians got a little antsy about this. They said, we can't ask people these questions. We're not trained mental health people. We are their doctors. What are we going to do asking these people? This is going to open Pandora's box. We're going to have people left and right asking for all sorts of things if we start asking these questions. So what they did was they set up a hotline and said, okay, we hear you. What we'll do is we'll set up this number. If anyone has any problems related to being asked these questions at any point, they can call this phone number and they will be immediately connected with some mental health services. We'll get them taken care of. We'll make sure this happens. So that eased the doctor's minds enough to be able to do the screening. During that sample, those years of the survey, any guesses how many phone calls they got? A lot? A lot like 100? Like 1,000? 17,000? There's sample size 17,000. The answer? 0. They didn't get a single call. And as a matter of fact, they got something they weren't intending. They started getting letters from patients thanking the doctors for asking these questions. They got people saying, wow, someone finally knows my story. I've been carrying this around forever, just waiting, and now you've asked, and now it's out there, and now I can take these steps that I need to take to help get some work through this. And the most touching one was a lady who was 90 years old, wrote a handwritten letter to her doctor after this happened. And she said, I'm 90 years old. I thought I was going to go to my grave, and no one would know my story. No one would know what happened to me. So thank you for asking. So that was the first thing that they started seeing, was a lot of really, really thankful patients who felt known by their doctors, who felt like someone in the world knew them. Then some really interesting things started happening with this study. They started noticing that doctor visits or ER visits started going down. And need for visits from the doctors for illness started going down. So physical health started getting better. This is without even any treatment. This is just someone hears your story. Which doesn't that fit with what we know about the brain and about being heard and understood and known, that this actually does something good to the body. The opposite of that, though, is also what they found. The results of the study was that they noticed, depending on a person's ACE score, they noticed some health problems that happened later in life. But here's kind of the results. With the physical side, what they found was that 28% of those 17,000 people had experienced physical abuse. 28%. And that's over a fourth. That's over 1 in 4. 20% had experienced sexual abuse. So that's 1 in 5 there. Emotional abuse, 10%. 1 out of 10 of those 17,000 people had experienced physical abuse. Neglect, 14.8% had experienced physical neglect. 9.9% had experienced, emotional neglect was 14%, physical neglect 9.9%, nearly 10%. Household dysfunction, 12% of people in that sample had seen their mother treated violently. 26%, over a quarter again, household substance abuse happened. 23.8% parental divorce, 12.7% household mental illness, and 4.7% of folks had a household member go to jail. This one you can't see so good up on the slide, but the results are actually in your handouts there as well. They kind of break this down a little bit more in terms of male and female. But also we look at the numbers of how many people had at least one. Well, actually, start with 0. So 36% of people had a score of 0, meaning none of these things happened. 36%. So a little over a third of people had a 0 for an ACE score, which leaves, again, nearly 2/3 of people had at least one of these things. So there's my number. Out of 3 people, the 2 people sitting next to you, either you or 2 of the others, have experienced at least one of these. So they broke it down by how many of those things had happened. For an ACE score of 1, 26% of the population had at least 1. 15% had 2, 3, 9.5% had 3, 12.5% had 4 or more. So this is a lot of people, a lot of your neighbors, your friends, co-workers, people you're in community groups with, church groups with, who experienced at least one of these traumatic events early in life. So then they started looking at what happened to people who had these ACE scores. So they started looking at things like alcoholism. So how rates of alcoholism rise related to ACE scores. And you can see with 0, we're down like between 2 and 4%. But then it jumps by 1 ACE score, 2 ACE scores, 3, 4. You see the rise here, which means the more trauma has happened, the more prevalence of alcoholism they found within that sample group. Same thing with antidepressant prescriptions. So how rates of antidepressant prescriptions rise along with ACE scores. So the higher amount of trauma a person experienced, the more likely they were, up to a person with an ACE score of 5 or more. If you had 5 or more of those things happen, nearly 100% from that population were prescribed antidepressants. Smoking, there's that rise again. This is a common shape in all of these slides, isn't that? It just gets higher and higher. Rates of suicide related to ACE scores, up to 4 or more, is close to 20% with attempted suicides. So those are some pretty specific things like alcoholism, smoking, suicide, depression, but they also linked it with lots of other health conditions. And there's some, it's kind of broken down there on your slide as well, the things that were associated with things like heart disease, things like obesity, things like lung disease, diabetes, all of those things, which Kaiser Permanente said, wow, this is a really big problem. Because the more trauma people experience, the more health outcomes go poorly for this person throughout the lifespan. So knowing this is super important. And it's culminated, and this is probably the most staggering of most of the statistics on this that I've seen. This looks at life expectancy according to ACE scores. So people with no ACE score, so none of that trauma has happened, typical life expectancy is around 80 years. A person with an ACE score of 6 or higher, their life expectancy decreased by 20 years. 20 years. So from 80 years down to 60 years. And the common denominator was the trauma. So at the time that the study came out, the director of the Center for Disease Control had a conversation with Dr. Felitti, who wrote the ACEs study, and said basically what we have on our hands here is a public health emergency. This is a crisis. What we're seeing is that these traumatic events that happen early in life have disastrous impacts on health outcomes throughout the lifespan. So they started talking and said, what do we do about this? How can we turn the tide here? Is there anything we can do to help with this situation here? And what they recommended was parent training. Parents who are more insightful. Parents who know what kids need and know how to meet their kids' needs and know themselves and are able to self-regulate so that these traumatic things don't happen, and we can stop the perpetuation of trauma within childhood. And this is why you're here. And this is why I mention this, is partly to congratulate you for being part of the solution, being part of making our community safer and healthier just by being better parents, just by knowing yourself better, knowing your kids better, and possibly knowing your kids' friends or people that they're connected with as well. So the more information out there, the better. So I'm going to go through, for some of you who have had kids who have experienced trauma that you know of or maybe don't know of. Also for folks who are doing foster care or some sort of substitutionary care. These are just some good things to know in terms of just being aware of what trauma looks like behaviorally. So the first thing we're going to look at is just kind of the symptoms of trauma as behaviors here. So first, a lot of times when people experience trauma, something that happens is they re-experience the trauma in certain ways. Sometimes through nightmares, intrusive recollections, so they're having thoughts racing through their minds, sometimes flashbacks, traumatic play. Sometimes when I talked about those triggers, sometimes a trigger will happen and it'll almost be like a movie playing in a person's head. And I've seen it where a child will be in the midst of play and all of a sudden we get a blank face. And all of a sudden I recognize they're off somewhere else. They've been triggered and they're at a point where it's kind of, they're re-experiencing it in some way. So avoidance of trauma triggers. Some kids will be resistant to certain memories or situations that remind them of the trauma. Exaggerated negative beliefs about oneself and about the world. So a lot of times thoughts about safety and people being safe or trustworthy get diminished when traumas happen. Persistent negative emotional state, inability to experience positive emotion. So there's a limited range of emotion that will sometimes happen associated with trauma. Feelings of detachment from other people. Sometimes there's just kind of this chasm. There's like this distance that you'll sometimes feel from other people. Or lost interest in or participation in significant activities. So the things that you used to think were fun, you don't think they're feeling so fun anymore. And these are all according to the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychiatric Disorders, the 5th edition. Inability to remember parts of the traumatic event. Sometimes this is a component of the flipped lid where you get a lot of sensory, but sometimes parts of that event, they just kind of get obliterated because of the intensity of the trauma that's happened. Sleep problems, irritability, reckless or self-destructive behavior, hypervigilance. This is kind of scanning the horizon, making sure that you're feeling safe. You're looking for the exits. You're looking for anyone who might possibly be a threat. And you're a little bit more vigilant than most because you've had to be. An exaggerated startle response. So loud noises, fast movements, things that might trigger the fight or flight in your brain that may be happening more often. And concentration problems. So difficulty focusing, which you can see how that would fit if a kid's got trauma brain and they've got memories that in these intrusive thoughts coming and going in their minds. Being able to focus on math problems or their reading could be really, really difficult for them at that point. This is important to know too, because a lot of times kids who've experienced trauma could easily be misdiagnosed as attention deficit. They're having difficulty focusing, maybe some irritability, maybe some negative behaviors, and it's an anxiety thing. It's a dissociation thing sometimes. They're in that trauma brain, but it can look like an ADHD sometimes. Super important to know the difference though. Because if you throw the traditional medical intervention for attention deficits, a stimulant. You throw a stimulant on a kid who's experienced trauma, then all of a sudden you've got a really awake, alert, fast-moving brain with a lot of anxiety happening, which can be really, really difficult to deal with. So attachment can be impacted by trauma as well. And there's kind of two sides of what happens with attachment when there's trauma that's happened. So the first side is what I call like the push side. This is kind of the reactive attachment. Kids who have reached to their caregivers for trust, and there's been trauma, relational trauma that's happened. So what you might see with the push or the reactive side is a child who rarely or minimally seeks comfort when distressed. This is kind of the roots of some of that dismissive attachment, or even some of the disorganized attachment. I'm going to get close, but then I'm going to pull back. A child who rarely or minimally responds to comfort when distressed. So they feel like they're not, they don't want comfort. They don't want you close to them when they're feeling upset. Or also minimal social and emotional responses to others. Some of the range of emotion gets limited. Episodes of unexpected irritability, sadness, and tearfulness, and limited expression of positive affect or joy. Now the other side is the pull side. The first was push. This is the pull. This is more of the what's called disinhibited social engagement, which means their inhibitions are lower when they're connecting with other people. So what happens with this is lack of reticence in approaching and interacting with unfamiliar adults. This means they get a little too close, a little too quick with people they don't know so well. Overly familiar verbal or physical behaviors, such as hugging strangers or sitting on the laps of unfamiliar adults. Willingness to approach a complete stranger for comfort or food, or to be picked up or to receive a toy. Diminished or absent checking back with the adult caretaker when in an unfamiliar situation. So they'll go off and not check back in so much. So that's kind of what the disinhibited side of that looks like. So before we go forward, I want to say that if there's a few of those things that pop up, some of those things are normal with other things as well. So it's not like if you see one of those things, then there's definitely trauma. But if you see clusters of them, if you see things, patterns, it may be something to kind of look into and see what's really going on here, what's the roots of this. And ultimately, if you're caring for a child that you know has experienced trauma, these behaviors, and they're all on your handouts there, are things to really get to know so that we don't mislabel those behaviors as a kid just being naughty, just being defiant, just being attention-seeking or out of control. All of those behaviors may be really, really connected to some trauma. So that's part of what we're doing with the insight here, is just becoming people who are aware, who understand when kids are acting these ways and there has been trauma, we know what's up. So we're going to watch a couple of videos here about what some of the experts have to say about trauma and the brain.
As recently as the 1980s, scientists believed a child's brain at birth was fairly static, largely predetermined by genetics. Researchers now know that's not true. While genetics clearly play a role, scientists know that relationships and experiences shape the brain. Think of a developing brain like a multi-storied house under construction. In this chapter, we'll explore the basics of brain development and help you understand how early traumatic experiences can design a different house. When we're born, our brains are teeming with more than 100 billion neurons or brain cells. Under optimal conditions, when our needs are met consistently by nurturing caregivers,
You got a red ball.
our brains thrive. These neurons connect in complex and vast networks, much like the electrical wiring in a modern home.
The baby comes with all this wiring, but it's the human interaction, looking into the eyes, being held, hearing the song of my mother, feeling the strong shoulder of my daddy, that begin to make the brain develop in very, very important ways for all of the life skills that will come.
At birth, the lower floors, or the downstairs part of the brain, is firmly wired in place by genetics, allowing a child to breathe, eat, sleep, and hear. Survival functions are rooted here. Very few connections in the upper floors are formed. These more sophisticated parts of the brain govern higher functions: complex thought, reasoning, emotional processing, memory, speech, and most importantly, the ability to regulate our behavior. It takes time and repeated experiences for this circuitry to develop and become hardwired in the brain. When a child experiences trauma, abuse, neglect, or other risk factors, it can skew the wiring of the brain, as well as the structure and the chemistry. The lower, more primitive survival part of the brain can overdevelop from reacting to fear, while the critical upper floors may underdevelop and suffer.
In the book that I wrote with Dan Siegel, The Whole Brain Child, we talk about an upstairs brain and a downstairs brain. For some kids,
Dr. Bryson is a psychotherapist at Pediatric and Adolescent Psychology Associates, Director of Parenting Education for the Mindsight Institute in California, and best-selling author along with Mindsight Executive Director Dr. Dan Siegel.
the upstairs brain is the more sophisticated part of the brain. It's our cortex that takes a long, long time to develop. And it's the part of the brain that allows us to regulate our emotions and calm down our bodies, understand ourselves, understand other people, and really be able to make good choices and be flexible and adaptive. The downstairs brain is much more primitive. It's actually really well developed at birth, and it's the limbic area and the brainstem connected to the body. And that part of the brain is much more reactive, and its job is to kind of constantly be watching for how to keep us alive.
Dr. Bryson's research and studies in attachment science, child rearing theory, and interpersonal neurobiology have made her a sought-after expert contributor with appearances on Good Morning America, PBS, and Red Book magazine. She says trauma triggers the watchdog part of the lower brain, called the amygdala, to work overtime.
And its job is to constantly sort of scan the environment, to be paranoid a little bit, to be watching, is everything okay here? Am I okay? Am I safe? Is anyone out to get me? Can I relax? And that part of the brain is always appraising what's going on around us, reading faces, reading the environment.
Do you like bubblegum? Yeah. No. Okay.
When children feel threatened or overwhelmed with fear, they may fight, run away, or shut down. The brain kicks into survival response, which researchers called fight, flight, or freeze survival mode. If the brain stays in this state too long because of trauma, it reorganizes around survival at the expense of healthy development of other parts of the brain.
So for a child who's had repeated exposure to fearful experiences, whether those be sort of a trauma like a car accident, or whether it's developmental or relational trauma, where the caregiver was frightening or they were left for long periods of time to manage their own fear states. The downstairs brain has gotten a lot of practice being active. It's the repeated experiences that we have that actually activate growth and connection in the brain. So if a child has had a lot of experiences where their downstairs brain that was reactive and fearful, that part of the brain gets really well developed. Whereas then the upstairs brain that knows how to calm that fear and kind of do that self-soothing, like, oh, that was a scary noise, but I'm okay now. That part of the brain may not be as well developed in children who have had repeated fearful experiences.
The impact goes beyond the upper and lower floors. The fear and stress of trauma also affect the left and right hemispheres of the brain, which help coordinate logic and emotion.
The left brain specializes in logical, literal, linear, and linguistic, which is using words, in those modes of processing information and going about in the world. The right hemisphere, on the other hand, is much more closely connected to emotion, to sensations in our bodies, to kind of looking at the whole picture as opposed to bits and pieces, and more random ways of processing information as opposed to linear. And the important part is that they work together as a coordinated whole. When children are in situations where their needs are not responded to, where their emotional states are not understood, or there is not a caregiver who responds consistently, quickly, and in an attuned way, the right hemisphere does not get nurtured. It doesn't get developed optimally. So when one side takes over, we can either be cut off from our emotions or we can become flooded by them.
It's not just our emotional balance that gets upset by trauma. It also disturbs the delicate balance between our brain chemistry and the hormones that drive our central nervous system and our entire being. In times of stress, our bodies produce the hormone cortisol, revving our bodies to a state of high alert. Periodic stress and short bursts of cortisol actually stimulate growth and help us adapt and change. When stress stays too high for too long, toxic levels of cortisol become corrosive and can lead to a host of long-term problems. Rockefeller University neuroscience professor Dr. Bruce McEwen is noted for his pioneering work on the impact of stress on the brain.
In a chronic stress situation, our lab has shown that that dendrites in some parts of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, will shrink and communication will be impaired.
Most critically, Dr. McEwen says chronic stress takes a heavy toll on the vital front part of the brain that controls emotion, memory, and attention.
The prefrontal cortex is very vulnerable, and when there is chaos in a child's life, lack of good attachment, development of the prefrontal cortex is severely affected. And it's involved in the downstream control of everything that's going on, whether it's impulsivity, whether it's aggression, anxiety. It helps control mood. It helps a person make decisions when to stop something, to do something else. It's the brain area that is so important for self-regulation, which is so important for success in everything that we do as adults.
Dr. McEwen is a best-selling author, former president of the Society for Neuroscience, and expert contributor for the PBS series This Emotional Life.
Early life adversity and toxic stress is often associated with increased frequency of disorders like obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, as well as brain problems such as substance abuse, antisocial behavior, depression.
When a child stays in elevated states of stress, that cortisol stress hormone washes over the brain and washes through their body. And we know that brains that are exposed to chronic cortisol look different from healthy brains.
And I'm wondering if we can outline the paper.
Doctors Karen Purvis and David Cross have conducted extensive testing on children who have experienced early harm. They've found severe imbalances in cortisol and neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are the chemical messengers the brain sends the body. Some excite and some calm, and trauma can dramatically upset the balance.
A young child who is getting optimal care has a balance in the brain chemistry. The chemicals about I'm afraid, I'm hungry, I'm cold, those are called excitatory, are balanced when the caregiver comes and gives warmth. And then the chemicals about I'm safe, I'm fed, I'm loved, we call those inhibitory, come into play. And so this child has excitatory but then inhibitory. So there's a balance in the brain chemistry. If a child has early trauma or harm, even brief early trauma or harm, these systems become imbalanced so that I'm afraid, I'm hungry, I'm scared, I'm lonely takes precedence. And there's very little of what would come when the needs were met. For children that we have seen over the years, and we've done neurotransmitter tests to test the level of this chemistry on more than 2,500 children. And what we find is dramatic levels of excitatory neurotransmitters, dopamine, beta-phenylethylamine, norepinephrine. We find glutamate that causes seizures very high in many of the children.
And research shows these imbalances also raise the risk for mental health issues and lots of behavioral issues. The takeaway message is this: trauma damages the brain, especially a young developing brain. It alters brain structure and upsets the delicate balance of brain chemistry that drives behavior. It puts a child at risk for a lifetime of problems.
I'm sorry.
But if you know the risk factors that predispose a child to harm, you'll be in a better position to quickly intervene and minimize the damage. Up next, key risk factors. Some may surprise you.
All right, any reactions, any takeaway, anything that kind of, just by watching this? There's a lot of bad news, but also some good news in there also. Anyone notice anything as you're watching this? Yeah. Lot to take in, huh? I was mentioning to someone in the back while we're just watching this of just what an important message this is, to understand the real impacts that trauma have on our kids. And this is a lot of why we do trainings on how to be great parents, is to, if there's any way possible, we can eliminate some of this and promote better brain growth, better attachment scenarios, better biochemical living. All of those things are important, and all of those things can be impacted by trauma. So yeah, the takeaway, there's some bad news. There's some real effects that the trauma has on the body, but the good news is that there are some ways to turn this story around as well. So we're going to watch this next short one that's just kind of giving a basic overview around some of the healing factors for trauma. So some things that can be done. And these are actually things that are actually healthy for all kids, but specifically for kids who have experienced trauma. Some ways to kind of cool down the heat of the nervous system and give some felt safety to those brains that have those really hyperactive amygdalas that are so sensitive to the stress around them. So this is Karen Purvis, who you saw in that last video, talking a little bit about trust-based relational interventions. So how do we intervene in ways that build trust with kids who have experienced some difficult situations?
TBRI, trust-based relational intervention, has at its core building a trusting relationship. It has 3 sets of principles, and they look at the child as a whole. When you think about development, the baby cries and I say, yes, I will comfort you. And so this child learns that they have a voice. They learn trust, which is the lesson of the first year of life. I can trust. There are so many children from hard places, and for those children, their capacity to trust has been fiercely damaged. The brain chemistry of a child who cries and no one comes is dramatically altered. The child with a history of trauma or loss or abuse has no hope of healing without a nurturing relationship. In every way that I make time and space, that I give touch, eye contact, and I give words, I am going to empower this child to go back to the beginning of what he or she should have experienced in the arms of a loving parent that said, when you cry, I will come. The phenomenal thing about a trust-based intervention is, as we connect to this child, as we build safety, we actually change the brain chemistry. We change the wiring of the brain. This is really the heart and soul of all that we are and all that we do. Do I look into the child's eyes? Do I touch their arm when I talk to them? When they talk to me, do I stop what I'm doing and talk to them? This is the essence of mindfulness. The excitatory chemicals about I'm afraid, I'm hungry, I'm cold, those are balanced when the caregiver comes and gives warmth. All regulation occurs first with an external regulator. So in the beginning, I regulate all. They're cold, I bring warmth. They're crying, I bring myself. And out of my regulation, their brain develops capacity for self-regulation. If this child didn't have this experience, that child doesn't feel safe. This chemistry can be altered, first by knowing they're safe, second by nutrient-rich foods, third by my environmental regulation of that child's emotion, and fourth by appropriate exercise. So we can balance brain chemistry by creating a holistic environment. We clearly have to deal with behavior. Correcting means showing a child the right behavior, praising him when he gets it, and showing it to him until he can get it right, and showing him with no fear and no shame, so that he builds success, not a greater sense of failure. So the message of hope for our families is that we can help our children to dramatic levels of healing. We simply have to be devoted to it and be willing to invest what it's going to take.
Seem doable? I mean, those are some things you can really do. Providing felt safety, letting kids know that they're safe when they're around you, keeping the environment safe around them. Things like the nutrient-rich foods, making sure kids are eating things that give them the right balance of energy that they need for their body. So they're not just eating sugar and hot Cheetos all day and Mountain Dew. You know, it's like that they've got some things that are helping their bodies regulate, even as far as staying hydrated. And Karen Purvis that's talking about that, she mentioned that most Americans are chronically dehydrated. Dehydration is actually linked to problems with regulating mood and emotion. So having a good drink of water, sometimes even when you're having a huge meltdown with a kiddo and you don't know anything else to do, just getting a cold glass of water, just share a glass of water, here you go. It is enough sometimes to kind of get the body back regulated again to doing what it needs to do. And exercise. Sometimes kids, especially kids whose bodies are amped up with a lot of cortisol, a lot of those chemicals that they just need to move and they're like crawling out of their skin. Appropriate amounts of exercise to burn some of that stuff off is fabulous. And I would say necessary, needs to happen. So if you know that you have a mover and shaker, make sure you're providing lots of good opportunities for those things to happen. All right. So we're going to watch another one. This one has Dr. Bruce Perry in it, and I think Dan Siegel's in this one also. This is some more kind of practical things around how we can provide what Karen Purvis was talking about, that idea of felt safety. What are some things we can do to help kids feel safe in our presence when they've experienced trauma? And be looking for it. There's one thing that he mentions on here that says is the kind of the number one factor for turning the tide with some of these experiences here.
Early childhood trauma changes the biology of the brain. Well, early childhood support also changes the biology of the brain.
What studies of resilience show that even when children have insecure attachments in the home, if they've had at least one secure attachment with a daycare provider, a preschool teacher, or another adult in their lives, then that makes a huge difference for them having the seed of resilience. They may still have difficulties, but because they've had that one secure relationship, that relationship where they felt that another individual, another adult knows them, feels what's going on inside of them, those kids have the potential to do very well in the future.
We can see imaging today of before and after trauma and see what happens in the brain, and we can also see repair that happens in the brain when our interventions have been successful.
What makes children get better following a trauma is connection to other human beings who are present, who are patient, who are kind, who are sensitive. And they don't need to be necessarily psychologically insightful. They don't need to know anything about trauma. All they need to know is that they're right there with this child. They're trying to be comforting. They're trying to be supportive. They're trying to encourage. Those kinds of interactions end up being much more therapeutic and healing than many of the other things that we try to do with kids.
Teachers can look more at their children, be more emotionally present for children, touch them, work on their own nervous system and their own regulation. If they're angry and they're out of control in terms of what's going on inside of themselves, the message that they're going to convey to the child is, I'm angry and I don't like you.
If you're an adult and there are children in your life, whether you're in law enforcement, a teacher, a parent, a foster parent, whatever you are, and you know that a child has been exposed to something that's potentially traumatic, the first thing that you should be aware of is that not all traumatic events lead to disastrous mental health outcomes. In fact, the vast majority of children that are traumatized actually do pretty well, but they do need your attention, they do need your kind support, and they do need your awareness about what are warning signs that would tell you to actually take the next step and try to get some professional help.
It's up to us. We can't wait for a they to do this spreading of the message that we can do something about it, that children, especially young children, have the most possibility for health and plasticity, for overcoming these early traumas if we as a community, a large community, support them.
We have permission now to meet children's needs. We have permission now from neuroscience to give children what they need, and to me that is so exciting.
If there was one place I would like to start with individuals as well as our society trying to make a difference, to really stop the cross-generational passage of trauma and of insecure attachment, it would be for parents to start a process of self-understanding. It basically costs nothing except the time and emotion that it takes for parents to begin on that process. And we all can do it. And the people who benefit most, besides ourselves, are our children.
We're spending literally 95% of our public dollars to change the brain, because that's what mental health is. That's what public education is. That's what juvenile justice intervention is. All of these are trying to change the brain. And we're spending almost nothing in the first 5 years of life when the brain is easiest to modify. And it takes the least amount of professional input, the least amount of insight. It takes just high-quality caregiving.
It's us, not they. It's each one of us doing it now, not later, but now.
So some good news on there. What do you notice? What's some of the good news? There's hope. There's hope. Yes, there is. That's the trauma that gets the brain in this space, but there's hope that it can actually change. Yeah, back there.
If they have at least one secure attachment style.
Just one is enough to turn the tide, right? It's enough to start that process. This is part of why we're mentioning this to everyone, is because it may not be your kid, but it may be your neighbor, your friend's kid. You might be that person who provides that sense of security and felt safety for either your own child or someone else in the community. Yes, awesome. Who else?
Showing praise and showing more love to the child.
Absolutely. It's like medicine, right? Showing praise, showing value to that child. So I love what Bruce Perry, probably the world's expert on trauma, says. It doesn't take a whole lot of knowledge and psychological understanding. What it takes is people willing to be caring and understanding in that moment. Good news, right? Fantastic. Anyone else? Any more good news? See, we have to balance this evening. We have to start with the bad news, right? That there's just a lot of trauma that's happened, a lot of things, and it does some really bad things to us. But boy, what a huge amount of hope there is. Yes?
Not every incident leads to crippling psychological.
That's awfully good to hear, isn't it? Especially when you see how prevalent it is, that not all of them end up with horrific things happening, right? But what did he say it takes? Yeah, it takes support. It takes people there to kind of help out when those things have happened. Great. So Bruce Perry and his Child Trauma Academy and is paired up with several others to come up with this neurosequential model of therapy, looking at how to work with kids who experience trauma. And it's really, it's pretty complicated, but basically, to simplify it, what you can know is that depending on where a kid is in their development and what's going on with the trauma, there may need to be different interventions. So if the idea is if talk is not working to get through to a kid, if that upstairs is not accessible because of the trauma, you may have to bump down a notch. You may have to go down to the downstairs, and instead of providing verbal reassurance, you might have to show some physical reassurance. Go to that downstairs brain, that feeling and that emotional state. You may have to soothe that part. And if that's not enough, you may even have to go down to the very bottom and even just breathing and sensory, showing the child that things are going to be safe, things being predictable, things being kind of calm and soothing to the child is what we want to know. So if you have a child that's in your care that's experienced some trauma, I'd look into this neurosequential model. It's really, really good stuff. And the idea is that everyone gets on the same page. The school, the therapist, the doctors, the parents, everyone understands, some kids need different things. For some kids, talking to them is going to work, and for some, the trauma is so profound that they need felt safety first. They might need more than just talk. So that's where you got to go. Okay, I'm going to wrap up talking about manipulation here. Who likes to be manipulated? When I just say that, you feel something, a little trigger. Like everyone hates being manipulated, especially when we're talking about kids. know what that is. It's like one of those things where it's like one of those hot buttons when you feel manipulated. But the good news is that here it is. Just because you feel manipulated doesn't mean that manipulation was the intention, especially when you're dealing with kids who've experienced trauma. Now, to be a good manipulator, a really good one, you don't know you've been manipulated until it's already over with, right? It takes a lot of thinking ahead, planning, a lot of being able to focus and delay gratification so that you can get them in the end. And for kids, a lot of those things that feel like manipulation may not be manipulation. So we'll watch a little bit of Karen Purvis here talking about manipulation and see if we have some other ideas of what manipulation may actually be, especially when trauma is at play.
Primary tools for children who didn't have a voice are manipulation and control. Now, all children explore manipulation, even in the most loving homes. All children explore control in even the most loving homes. Again, this is a normal developmental exploration. For the child from the hard place, manipulation may have become the way they believe they survived. Control may be what they believe stood between them and death. Now, when we look at a child with these issues, obviously those issues are not okay. But again, I don't want to overreact. I don't want to label my child a controller or a manipulator. I want to stand back from the behavior and realize it has a function. So if a child is saying something to me, for example, they want something, but they're using a manipulative round to get there, I will say, well, stop, sweetie. Now I'm going to be matching. I'm going to be looking into their eyes, and I'm going to say, now, whoa, stop. I want to meet your need, but I need honest words, not this little roundabout. Okay, so give me honest words. Let me see what we can do. Let's work it out together. And very often I will find a child say, well, I really want X. Now, if it's in my power at that moment, I'm going to say yes, because I want my child to know they don't have to use tricks to be heard by me. Now, I can't always say yes, obviously. I shouldn't always say yes, but I can say it a lot more often than I do. So we know from child development that there's a continuum of two poles that predict the best development long term: predictability and control. So some of our children have come from very unpredictable environments. Some of them have come from very controlling environments. But appropriate levels of predictability and control will help our children let go of the need to control the world. We have mothers who come to us saying, my child tells me what shoes to wear in the morning. So I say to that child, you know what, it's not okay for you to tell mommy what to wear, but let's go to your room and choose what you'll wear tomorrow. So I'm going to take away control of the world by giving my child appropriate control. Every one of our children must have appropriate control in their environment, and they must be able to predict what's going to happen. So I can take away these tools by giving, I can take away manipulation and control by giving my child appropriate levels of predictability and control in their environment. I can become their partner. Again, it's very important to come alongside of the child. It's not like, aha, gotcha, being bad, but rather, sweetie, let's work on this together. That's not okay. I'm listening to you. Tell me what you need. So one of the primary mistakes that parents make about this is thinking, my child is so controlling, I'm going to take away control of everything. And see, they're going to learn to make good choices by making small choices. I remember one darling little girl we worked with who had to be in control of everything, and she was just a tiny little bitty snippet of a thing. She was like 5 years old. But her mother was there, and I was there with her in the home, and her mother said, sweetie, we're going to have a peanut butter sandwich for lunch. Come on to the table. And she said, no, I have a better idea. Let's have a peanut butter sandwich for lunch. The little thing just had to feel like she was in control. And so we got down at her height and we looked her in the eye and said, no, Mama already decided on the sandwich, but you could decide between these 3 fruits for our dessert. What do you choose? So see, I'm going to let a child have some control. I'm sharing power. They're going to practice making choices in a controlled environment so that they don't have to take over the world. I have had a child come, for example, to our camp who was hungry many, many times. He would come into the camp door every morning asking exactly what we would have to eat all day long. And I went through what we would have for the morning snack and what we would have for the noon snack and what we would have all day long. And I did that with him for a number of days, more than a week. Every day I went through. And one morning he came in and I said, sweetheart, today, would you go with me and look in the kitchen and let me show you? We have so very much food. And I promise you, you're never going to be hungry here. But just for today, would you trust Miss Karen? I'm going to meet every hunger, need you have. And you just get to be a little boy today. So for that little period of time, that little boy could practice trusting me just that long, just a few hours, that there was plenty to eat. Our children learn to make good choices as they trust that they have a voice and as they trust that we see what they need. And in that environment, they will give up control and manipulation in terms of relationship.
Very powerful stuff, huh? So you get what she's saying. For some kids, life has taught them that when the grown-ups are in charge and in control, bad things happen. When I trust and when I give control over here, when I let the adults be the adults, difficult things happen, bad things happen, scary things happen. And for some of those kids, they've learned that control and even manipulation to feel control is that feeling of life or death sometimes. So understanding that learning to trust a grown-up again for a kid whose trust has been broken can be extremely difficult. It can be very, very challenging. So expecting that you might get some pushback when you're taking away the tool that's helped a kid feel safe for so long, and understanding that those behaviors that look a lot like just controlling, disorganized, angry, manipulative behaviors may be related to some underlying trauma for that child, and that this stuff takes time. You know, every time they feel that you are one that they can trust, that you are staying safe with them, and you are providing for their needs, and you are being caring and listening and understanding, that's putting that much more trust back into the brain that this is a process that I can do. They're getting kind of back to that earned security, which they might have missed. So looking at it as willful or intentional is especially with kids who've experienced trauma, really kind of missing the point. And even kids who haven't experienced trauma, those natural and normal explorations of control and manipulation can be, we can put our adult lens on it sometimes and say they're just being manipulative, or we could look at it as, hey, they're using some really not so good tools to try to get a really real need met. Right? A dysfunctional means to meet a very real felt need. So we get to walk along with them and help them figure out how to get those needs met in ways that are helpful, mostly by providing safety. I'm going to wrap up tonight with Bruce Perry's quote. I love this. So this, you saw him on the video. He's the world kind of expert on childhood trauma. He says, the more healthy relationships a child has, the more likely he will be to recover from trauma and thrive. Relationships are the agents of change, and the most powerful therapy is human love. So you could be that one person providing that therapeutic element to in some very real ways, change the life of a child, change the brain architecture of a child, change the way a child sees the world. So you've got those... All right. Also, I just wanted to put a quick plug out here also, as we're connected at CAFA with some other organizations that really are trying to do our part in the community to help out with this whole issue around trauma and children. So if you are interested, I would Google Safe Families for Children, Safe Families Lane County, or else Every Child. Both of them are organizations who are working in some very real and very tangible ways to help with this issue of kids who have come from difficult places or families who are experiencing traumatic events in our community. So if you want to help out with this any further, those are some good places to start. But we're going to leave this tonight with just kind of that idea of hopefulness, right? There's bad news, yes, but there's great news that we can make a huge difference in a child's life. Next week, we're going to move on to what are some of the nuts and bolts around how to actually intervene with our kids and solve some real-life problems with our kids in their lives, and some practical hands-on sorts of approaches to how do we keep all of this good stuff in our minds about how we keep our own understanding of our own selves and our own experiences. We understand our kids. Now we're going to start bringing it together, and how do we do this stuff together as a team. So have a wonderful night. Thank you. If you have any questions, thoughts, comments, feel free to come up to me afterwards.